Hello and welcome to Emsi webinars. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have an exciting webinar ahead of us, hosted by Emsi Burning Glass's Andy Derman with Duncan Brown, our senior economist. But we also have an exciting guest with us, which is David Allison from Get My First Job. If you have any questions during the course of this webinar, please put them in the question box on the control panel, and we will endeavour to get back to those at the end of presentation. If not, then we will follow up afterwards. You will be receiving a follow-up email with the recording and slides from today's presentation, so keep your eyes open for that. So without any further ado, I will hand over to you, Andy. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Debbie. Thank you very much. And hello, everyone out there joining us today or listening back on the recording. It's great to have you with us. Thank you very much for joining us. And I'm very excited not only to partner back up with my good friend Duncan, who you've all got to know over the months, and we'll wander through some of our usual stuff there, but great to have David joining us, and we'll introduce him shortly as we dig into the meat of the webinar. So for those of you who are new or have yet to be fully indoctrinated, a big warm welcome from Emsi Burning Glass. A reminder that our purpose as an organization and all of us that work here is really about helping organizations and the communities and stakeholders that they engage with themselves to make better, more informed decisions about the labour market. And there is, as we've been charting over the last, year or so, a lot going on in the labour market, and that continues to be the case. And so we hope these webinars can serve to keep you up to speed with the latest trends, and certainly we can share what we're seeing, and ever more so turning our attention to where the labour market is heading and some of the crunch points, and today's topic certainly dives into that, which I'm excited to get into with you folks. Of course, a reminder that we have a whole range of tools and services that leverage labour market information so that you yourselves can dip into the insights that are going to help you with the key decisions that you're making as an organisation, and in order to serve the communities that you do well in a time of great change in the labour market. So thanks for joining us today and working with us and taking our data out into your communities to genuinely make a difference in the world of work and people's lives. So we will, as usual, and has been the usual form for a good number of months now, take a quick walk through some of the headline trends affecting the labour market, and I dare say in due course some of these will start to drop off as the world changes around us. But over to you, Duncan. Welcome and thanks for joining us again. So I'll let you walk us through the usual delights.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's often how labour market data are referred to, the usual delights. As you say, these are probably, these charts beginning to get quite samey, and so therefore they might not become such a regular feature anymore, which is a shame because I've tarted them up a bit for this time. But so yeah, let's start off with our normal one, which is looking at the standard macro labour market measures. So on the left hand side we have the time series charts for unemployment, redundancies and vacancies, and the situation is as it has been for the last few months, where unemployment continues to fall, getting sort of about halfway, nearly halfway back to where it was at the start, maybe a bit less than halfway, but the trajectory is really strong month on month. We had that slight blip a few months ago where it seemed to slow down, but then it's gone fast again, where unemployment is really falling fast. And I mean, just compare it to when unemployment was at similar levels back in sort of 2016, and how slow the decline was at that point. It's kind of declining at sort of 2 or 3 times the speed now compared to what it was 5 years ago from similar levels. And the reason for that is that the vacancy rate is going into sort of nosebleed territory, I might say. There's 1.1 million vacancies on the ONS vacancy survey in September, which is I mean, it had never been above 1 million before COVID, and now we've had 2 months over 1 million. and as a share of the number of people in the workforce, it's in sort of the 3% sort of area, which is again unheard of, and redundancies continue to be way back down towards pre-COVID levels. You'll see these grey bands there. There's one in 2008 to 2019, which is the great financial crisis and the recession back then. And then we've got them for the lockdowns, and I'll explain a bit more about them on the next slide because they're important. On the right-hand side there, we've got the beverage curve, which is a labour market economist's chart for looking at these kinds of questions, which is quite confusing. So I'll give the normal explanation for them. On the x-axis, we have the unemployment rate, as we all know, and well, maybe not love it. And then on the y-axis, we have vacancy rate, which is the vacancies as a share of the number of people looking for work, either in work or unemployed. And normally it moves along this diagonal line, going sort of from top left to bottom right. And we've got that coloured into sort of 4 different stages. So 2006 to 2009, when everything was going sort of pretty badly because the financial system imploded, and we saw vacancies fall sharply and then drag unemployment with it. Then we had that long, slow recovery from 2010 to 2016, which eventually brought it back to the level that it was before the financial crisis. And then from 2016 to 2020, surprisingly, it tightened further, going into sort of recent record territory, sort of unemployment back to the levels that we'd last seen in the 70s. And then we have the purple period, which is when COVID happened, and we saw vacancies really fall off a cliff, first of all, where it goes straight down, hitting a vacancy rate of 1%, unheard of in sort of recent times, even in the worst of the recession. But unemployment didn't really rise at first, mainly because of furlough. Then furlough started to have a more limited impact. It can only do so much, and so unemployment did rise, and went from sort of the 3-4 to above 5% level. And then, but while it did so, vacancies started to come back. And then in the last few months, we've seen unemployment start to fall again, as we've just been discussing, but vacancies have just gone through the roof. And so we're now at this point above that diagonal, which is territory that we've not known before, where labour market demand is galloping away, and there's not actually a lot of unemployment, thankfully, a lot less than we thought that there was going to be, to soak it up as well. So we are into, we've gone in a year from really being worried about the labour market to feeling it being very tight. And the sort of the only kind of outstanding question is whether the sort of the end of furlough at the end of September is going to release a lot more workers into unemployment than we've known before, and it's too early to know on the data. We'll have to wait a month or two for that to come through. But certainly, anecdotally, there doesn't seem to be a great sense that there's kind of a sudden turnaround and that we remain in a very tight labour market. So on this one, and I've changed this slightly in ways that I'll explain in a moment, what we do here is for each industry grouping of occupations is that we plot them from the start of 2020, so just before COVID, to the most recent month available. And the purple lines are job postings. And whereas before we benchmark them to February 2020, what I've done here is benchmark them to the same month in 2019 as the last full year of normality. And the sort of the black horizontal line is 100%. So if the purple line was tracking that, then it would be exactly the same as 2019. And then the green lines are the share of workforce in each industry that are furloughed. And so you can see that the line was a lot higher in accommodation and food services at the top left than it was in, say, information and communications, which is second down on the right. And so there are a few things to note here. So the first one is that furlough is over. I actually simulated the last 2 months of data for furlough because I know what happens. It's a bit like Titanic. You know the boat sinks, and so the green line all gets to 0, and we know that. But the purple lines, that is live data from our job postings, and what we can see is that in every single industry group, we are way above the levels that we saw in 2019. So the lowest in terms of labour market demand compared to 2019 is education, which is 26% above the level in 2019. and it's now, whereas admin and support services, which includes a lot of logistics functions and things like that, is 77% above. And then we've got areas like accommodation and food services and wholesale and retail trade, which are in the 60s percent above the levels that they were at before. So labour market demand is really, really running hot. It's to an extent that we were really not anticipating if you'd have gone back a year ago. So next slide, please. So one of the things that we were all very worried about back, if I go to last year, was that unemployment was starting to rise and that this was especially going to affect young people. And we know that young people are often affected in recessions. That's kind of a standard sort of experience, and we often worry about it. But what's and there's an additional dimension here, that the kind of jobs that young people often go into when they're leaving education or while they're in education as well, are those kind of jobs that have been most affected by the COVID switch off. So if we think about things like hospitality and tourism and things like retail, and no surprise, we see youth unemployment really going up quite strongly. And so we've got the two age categories here. We've got 16, 17-year-olds on the left-hand side and 18 to 24 on the right-hand side. And both of them, you can see, so the way the chart's constructed is that we have the months of the year and then the 3 years separately. So green is 2019 is our kind of last full normal year. The black lines, or nearly black lines, are 2020 when things started to go wrong, and then 2021 are where things carried on going wrong until they started to get better. And what you can see in both cases is that in 16 to 17-year-olds, they're rapidly approaching normality, having gone up quite a way in the first half of 2021. So going up from a typical level of around 20%, which is high, but for reasons I'll go on to, it's not as concerning as you might think. In 2019 to around 35% at its height in the spring of this year. Now getting back down to about 25%, but falling fast. So I would anticipate by the end of the year, really back down to normal levels. And in 18 to 24-year-olds, converging back to the 10% level. One of the reasons why the rates seem high is because, first of all, it is often more difficult for young people to find jobs, but also the numbers of people involved are often quite small. Most young people, certainly 16 to 17-year-olds, are actually in full-time education and not looking for work. And so it's actually only a sort of a minority part of the sort of the age group that are actually looking for work at any one time. And so sort of relatively small numbers of unemployed people make for a really large rate as a share of those that are actually sort of in the labour market. And you get a similar effect, although more muted, amongst 18 to 24-year-olds, because of course a lot of them are in university, for example. So yeah, quite interesting that although the headlines quite understandably were of a really worrying labour market for young people in the first year of COVID, in the last few months they have been part of the rapid tightening. Actually, just go back to that, because there's one thing that I also want to mention, which is that there's part of this which is a little bit interesting in the sense that the sort of the increase in young unemployed people, especially in the 16 to 17 category, is actually slightly misleading in the sense that there are actually fewer unemployed people, even though the rate went up. And actually there's more unemployed people now, even though the rate's fallen. And the reason is because of participation. Because actually, given the COVID situation, for natural reasons, it seems as if quite a few young people took the opportunity to go into full-time education or stay in full-time education compared to what they would have done otherwise. And so you see that even at the height of sort of 16, 17-year-old unemployment, there were 94,000 unemployed people. Whereas if I go back to February 2020, there were 105,000 unemployed 16 to 17-year-olds. And that's because actually sort of the overall number of people in the labour market in that age category was higher. And now there's more unemployed young people, even though the rate's lower, because actually more of them are returned to the labour market. And if you think about it, one of the interesting things with this age group is that it's very small. It's only a 2-year age group. So between February 2020 and now, 3/4 of that age group has actually changed. And so if you entered into being in this age group, say you turned 16 in April 2020, and you were or turned 17 then, and you were looking for a job, well, actually, you might have chosen to stay in full-time education because of the COVID situation, because the job opportunities are not there. And so actually, even these surface rates can be quite sort of misleading in terms of what's actually going on under the surface.
Duncan, quick question: Would participation in programs like Kickstart would that naturally take people out of the labour market from a statistical perspective and put them into the education bracket? So those short-term interventions, do they help sort of massage the figures a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure so much whether they're massaging the figures so much as changing the basis of them. I mean, you're moving people from potentially being active in the labour market to being inactive, and so you're taking one out of the numerator and the denominator in mathematical terms. So it will lower the unemployment rate if they were otherwise going to be unemployed. But yeah, it will have an effect. I mean, and that's partly by design. I mean, certainly, I know the Department for Education were very keen to encourage young people to stay on in education because it was a good time to do so. Because the labour market opportunities, especially for those that would otherwise have left around sort of 17 years old, were not great. I mean, if you are entering the labour market at that point and you're probably going to look for sort of quite consumer-facing services jobs, well, they just weren't recruiting at all. And we know that from the previous set of charts that we've got here, that during 2020, a lot of those labour markets and in the sort of the first half of 2021 were really flat. And so actually, by design, you don't want them going in there. But yeah, it is interesting that the sort of are big concerns about young people, which are completely understandable, but actually we possibly overestimated the degree of the problem that was going out there and underestimated sort of how effective those interventions had been in sort of mitigating those impacts.
Interesting.
Yeah, and one last chart, and you'll understand that because we've got David with us as well, explain these charts are kind of getting to the sort of a particular kind of part of the labour market, which David has brought us some data that can help us understand, is that another dimension of education leavers is around apprenticeships, of course. And so what we thought was an interesting trend to plot was the number of vacancies that we were able to source from apprenticeships.gov.uk from the start of 2020 compared to the same month in 2019 again. And you can see that at first, the number of vacancies really hit the floor. In the sort of the middle of 2020, it was well down on where it had been in 2019. But recovered fairly well, so that by the end of 2020, it was actually getting back to normal. Took a bit of a dip with the sort of lockdown 3, as it's often referred to, the second full lockdown at the start of 2021. But since then, and this is really interesting given what we hear about the tight labour market, is that actually apprenticeship recruitment is at really high levels, and that actually there's a lot of employers seeking to hire apprentices. And again, this is a good sign from a youth employment point of view. There's a lot of interest in there, and sort of anecdotally, all the stories that we hear about the sort of the difficulties of recruiting workers generally will, of course, make employers start to think about whether growing your own is kind of a more reliable strategy. And to some extent as well, there's a catch-up dimension to this, that having sort of paused a lot of apprenticeship recruitment in 2020, there's a wish to kind of balance that out by higher recruitment now. So, but yeah, again, the sort of the underlying health of the education leaver labour market looks a lot stronger, world stronger really, than we were anticipating a year ago.
Indeed. Thank you, Duncan. I appreciate the walkthrough. And always useful context, I think, particularly specifically for the topic of today. And so for those that have been following on over the last few months, we've been really exploring, as we've seen employer demand really really take off post-pandemic, and as the economy picks back up again, and we had dived into topics like the green and STEM economies to try and understand and unpick those as clearly strong drivers to our current and future economy. What's really apparent as we look at that data is that you mentioned earlier that we'd sort of been very worried about the labour market, and now to some extent we are less so, although actually we might be more worried, because actually there are still problems, but they're nice problems to have rather than bad problems to have, which is where we entered into kind of tracking what was happening out there. And so as an organization, we've wanted to really try and unpick and understand really what is happening, and it's a bit of a puzzle out there. We're hearing a lot of challenge and I suppose negativity about the labour market, not because as a result of it booming and the fact that demand is so high, and it appears that supply just cannot meet demand. And I think a lot of what you've shown there really reinforces that. And so we've decided to through the rest of this year to really try and see if we can unpick some of that, particularly thinking at that new entrant to the labour market end of things. And so this is where we've come together with our good friends at Get My First Job, who are able to help us unpick some slightly different aspects of it. As you know, we've been tracking demand, and our data often is very focused towards demand, and so we wanted to try and get a handle on entrance to the labour market and supply. And this is where our friends at Get My First Job come in. So I'd like to welcome now to this session David Allison, who's the co-founder and CEO of Get My First Job. So welcome, and thanks for joining us, David.
Hi Andy, thank you very much.
Great stuff. So before we get into some of the research that we wanted to share today and flag for the coming month or so, tell us just a little bit about Get My First Job and what you guys do.
Sure, thank you. So we're a social enterprise. We've been going for, it surprised me actually, about 10 years. I was looking at the data the other day. So our first candidates registered back in January 2022, sorry, 2012 rather. And since then we've been on a mission. It's a mission that hasn't really changed at all. And it's about inspiring young people from every background to connect with insight, development and employers. So we work at the interface between education and the labour market. And 10 years on, we have about 1 million people use our main website every year, and probably about another 1 million use some of the other solutions we've developed with large employers, LEPs, charities, and so on. And those customers and partners allow us to get a really interesting insight into what is going on. So we really start to look at opportunities from things like school work experience. We then look at the next stages up, so school leaver programs, whether that be traineeships, apprenticeships, also then into university recruitment, around placements, and also graduate programs. We very much then are focused, and we look at our world through the lens of young people making either their first decision or maybe tweaking those decisions in the very early stages of their career. And at heart, I mean, I'm an engineer by training. I love technology and data as a way of supporting real change within the system. And I think the fundamental problem we saw all those years ago was that the probability of the right young person finding the right website with the right opportunity on it, on the day it happens to be there, understanding it and applying it, it's so mathematically remote to be almost just discounted at face value. So what we're interested in is helping young people explore what's out there, building up the picture of them, but then helping them understand what a job might be. You know, the practicalities of where it is, how much it pays, what the career prospects and so on are. And as a result, we've got loads of lovely data, which is relevant both, I think, to this conversation, but also the real-time use of data with some of our clients to help them understand who is looking at these opportunities, who they're connecting with. I think that's really important when we're looking at things like social mobility, and particularly with the way in which the pandemic has had an impact on different young people and different communities in different ways. So yeah, that's a very quick intro to us and the way we look at this problem.
Yeah, thank you, David. That's fantastic, and I would encourage anyone who's not come across you guys, and I'm sure there are fewer and fewer of them, given the great work that you do, but if you haven't, feel free to check out the website and learn more. I'm sure David would be happy to tell you more. And I think, as you state, you know, the work that you do illuminates some interesting connections, and we were keen, given the environment we're in, and particularly the theme of the day currently is just how tight the labour market is, and it's hard to forget a world before coronavirus, but those were conversations that we were having going into the pandemic. The pandemic shook things up a little for us all, but actually we've re-emerged now, and it's an even more acute problem. And so I think the great challenge is when you have such a tight labour market, it needs to work as efficiently and effectively as possible, and there are many areas in which things can not work so efficiently. So it's great that you're filling in some of those roles and trying to join those dots. But as you say, what it's also the great work that you're doing is highlighting some interesting data points that we saw, that as we understood the demand side, we were able to work with you to unpick and explore some of the connections between supply and demand. So you kindly shared some information with us, and we'll share a few tidbits now and tell you a bit more about what's coming down the line. But I'm going to hand back now to Duncan, who's been having fun playing with the data and connecting it together. And you've got some interesting insights to walk us through. And then David will bring you back in as we try and contextualize and understand what the data is telling us. So Duncan, over to you.
Yeah, so Get My First Job data is quite interesting from an Emsi burning glass perspective, because we are very good at telling you about the demand side trend. So we can tell you all about how many jobs there are being advertised for, how many, what kind of candidates employers are looking for, all those kind of questions. Is demand racing ahead? But we've got much less of a sort of visibility on the sort of the supply relative to demand. And as functionally a job board, Get My First Job allows us to look at sort of how candidates are responding to the demands that are put in front of them. So employers are posting vacancies there, and which ones are candidates deciding to opt into for their interest, how many education leaders are interested in each vacancy. And it's that ratio, the interested candidates per vacancy, that we focus on here, because how that changes over time gives us a good insight into sort of the how tight the labour market is and how loose it's been over the sort of the COVID period, really. So it should be said that this is a partial view. It's one job board. It's not the experience on Get My First Job might not be representative of every job board, although sort of all the signs around us are of a tight labour market, and the data from Get My First Job is sort of suggesting that direction. But it's also interesting in terms of the last two charts that we were looking at, the sort of the young and employed ones and the apprenticeship one, that because this is focused on the education labour market, sort of it's quite a sort of an interesting test at a particular margin of the labour market. So if we go on please.
I might add as well, just quickly, a good purpose of the focus, of course, is in a tight labour market. Employers who maybe haven't traditionally considered pursuing new entrants to the labour market, of course, that could be one route to them meeting needs that they couldn't meet from their traditional means. So hopefully, insights will be helpful to that as well.
Absolutely, yeah. It's in the current labour market, it's a lot easier than having to try and poach people away from other employers if you can actually find somebody who's interested in the job for a start. So we start off with this chart, which really just helps to explain the data, but gives a sense of what the pattern is like across all. And what we'll find eventually is that the pattern's fairly similar across sectors. So again, just as with the young unemployment charts earlier, the way this chart's set up is that we've got each of the months along the bottom, and then we've got each year in a different colour. And so we've got 2020 is the green line, which was motoring along at around 25 interested candidates per vacancy in January and February, and then something happens after March, which transforms everything, and we know what that is, that the coronavirus happened and we had lockdowns and all the rest of it. And so the number of interested candidates per vacancy goes 5 times pretty much the level that it was from March to the level that it was in April. And my guess is, and I'm sure David will be able to sort of correct me if I'm wrong, that will mainly be because the demand dried up, that actually the number of vacancies fell through the floor. We know this from Emsi Burning Glass's data, and so actually those candidates that were left looking for jobs had a really narrow set of opportunities to focus on, and so you went for those that were there. And that sort of extremely loose labour market that we see at that level really only stayed around for a couple of months before things started, as we went into summer last year, to come back down to planet Earth a bit. But we see quite a long, slow move back to kind of a more normal level, which we reached at the end of last year, where sort of an equilibrium was found. It spiked up again in January because we had that further lockdown, but not nearly as much as it did in the first lockdown. And then since then, it's been in sort of continued decline, especially since May. We've seen month-on-month falls in the ratio of candidates per vacancy, so that whereas our normal pre-COVID level was around 25 candidates interested for every vacancy there, now we're down at the sort of the 5 level. So we've really seen it's really difficult to get candidates to notice your vacancy and be interested and start the application process. And it's sort of gone from a sort of a moderate position to an extreme sort of loose position where there were so many candidates chasing after every vacancy, to now the opposite, all within the space of 16, 17, 18 months.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and this is where I'd like to bring David back in, so hopefully help us contextualize this a little bit. So it is fascinating, obviously, that spike, which I think unless you've got another reason for, is probably just reflecting on the data we saw earlier in a collapse of vacancies right across the labour market, including in this kind of in your sphere. But it's interesting that perhaps as the labour market has picked back up and opportunities have risen, that it seems like the candidate pool chasing those opportunities has lagged somewhat. So I'm just interested to get your take on that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you're right. I mean, you go back to where we were April last year, and obviously employers were having to deal with the practical implication of lockdown, and that meant dealing with furlough, meant dealing with their own staff first of all. So we did see a very, very rapid change in the whole apprenticeship space, because it just wasn't practical to advertise these and bring new people into a workplace when workplaces were being shut down. And I think there are a few peculiarities of the early talent environment, and that is certainly one of them. But I still don't think we've completely nailed in the new way of working. Is how do you help young people in those first days and weeks if you're not working in a single workplace or a normal workplace where all that support is offered? So I think apprenticeships were hit harder than almost anything else as we went into lockdown. And also, I mean, I know there are lots of people who are involved with the education world on this webinar, but the practicalities of being allowed into a workplace to sign up a learner, even if you were able to advertise it and appoint somebody, that all went into freefall. So I think one of the challenges when we're talking about supply and demand in the labour market is that this is also really influenced by the supply and demand within the education market. And therefore we had a situation where learning providers were very much focused by current learners to make sure they could support them by moving to their online delivery modes. And all of this was going on in the background over what looks like a superficial change in just the number of jobs that were available. So I certainly think that those first 3 or 4 months of lockdown, there is so much that sits behind that green line, which on one hand just looks like a bit of a loose thing in the jobs market.
Very interesting. And as we see, obviously the vacancies start to pick back up, but the statistics here suggest that the volume of candidates is not quite matching that. Do you think that's just a lag, or actually has the world changed in some senses in terms of student choice and thinking about this as a route into the labour market? Are we still have we retrenched back to the traditional full-time education realm to see this thing out and things will pick back up, or are you picking up signs that there's been a sort of a cultural shift at play here?
I think that I'm not sure it's a lag so much. One of the other interesting facts about this market is pretty much it's the same size every year. So it's defined by the number of people leaving full-time education. So unlike the rest of the labour market, where we all think we can get a pay rise by going out into the market looking for a new job, all of a sudden you can get several million new job seekers enter the market. That's not what goes on here. It's a much more static pool who are going through that cycle. So that does make it slightly different, and I think that probably works against the kind of the lag argument. However, what you've also got to think about is the other things that are happening. And again, the funded learning element comes into this quite a lot, because at the same time as we've seen massive demand increases from straight employment, we've also seen initiatives like traineeships, like boot camps, like the SME incentives as well, all of which are feeding into the way in which young people are being talked to by both training providers, colleges, as well as employers themselves. So all of that is adding to the noise and the tension within the market. And I do think when we step back, one line on a chart, actually, an average is never going to be the accurate number. It's going to be simply kind of an amalgamation of other points of accuracy. When I look at what's going on, I think we are seeing a fundamental change in the way in which apprenticeships are working at the moment. Now, there are a group that I would pull together and say are kind of like returning to steady state. So things like healthcare, like social care, apprenticeships have always been an important part of that sector. It's challenging, but actually those numbers are coming back to pretty much where we would expect them to be. But we're also seeing sectors where apprenticeships are very much used, such as retail, such as hospitality, where Brexit has had a massive impact. And therefore, as your chart was showing earlier on from the National Apprenticeship Service statistics, we're now seeing more vacancies than we have done in recent history. So if you have more vacancies but the same size cohort, the only logical conclusion is you are going to have less applicants for opportunity that exists. And that's the fundamentals, I think, that we're now seeing play through. But it's making it incredibly competitive in the same way that the overall jobs market is competitive.
Fantastic. No, really helpful insights, as you say. There's always a lot of stories behind some lines, and we do love lines here and bar charts and all sorts, but it's good to get the stories. And actually, to your point, this is where we then dived into, is thinking about it from a sectoral position to try and maybe elicit some of those exemplars. So Duncan, want to navigate us through here? I think it probably references a lot of what David was just mentioning.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are the same charts, but for individual sector areas. And so, you see from administration at the top to teaching and education at the end there. The sort of the same underlying story is clear of, a very kind of, explosive rise in kind of labour market looseness, if you will, in the first part of 2020, or the second quarter, really, and then a sort of a slow decline back to normal toward the end of 2020, and then 2021 being a much more sort of difficult terrain. The data get noisier as you sort of take a narrower lens to them. That's quite normal. And of course, the sort of the variation between sectors is interesting, because some jobs are just much more open to a wider pool of candidates than others as well. But the sort of the underlying trend is still there, sort of very clearly. I mean, one that is quite interesting is construction, which had a real surge in candidate interest in the first part of 2021, no doubt because that was one of the areas that was kind of opening up quickest, and sort of really growing back strongly. And anybody, as I regularly mention on these webinars, who's tried to get a builder knows that that trade has been really sort of going strongly from the start. And yes, I am trying to get an extension built. Yeah, it's quite interesting. And property and real estate is similar there as well. But yeah, so but even in those cases, that sort of initial wave of candidate interest is subsided, and so now on the latest data, it's kind of there are very few that are anywhere other than a lot tighter than they have been before.
Yeah, and we can look at that data in a slightly different way to compare.
Yeah.
Like,
yes, this is one of those charts that I put together to confuse people, but the reason is because it tells an important story. So what I wanted to do, because that data is really noisy, is just try and get a single metric that allows us to see how much tighter the labour market in each sector is now compared to what it was before. And so I took the sort of the interested candidates per vacancy measure in February of last year, so before, back in those innocent days when we were hearing dimly about some pandemic that we thought had nothing to do with us, and then from last month, October 2021, and sort of taking the ratio of them. So how much has the sort of the the level of labour market tightness changed. And I've had to do it on a log scale because the ones at the top here, property and real estate and hospitality and food, are extremely tighter than they were at that point last year. You know, in the hundreds and over 1,000 in property and real estate terms. The nature of these data mean that they can see quite large swings. But it's quite interesting that you get quite a mix at the top there. That, you know, hospitality and food and retail and sales, in some ways, I'd expect to have tightened up a lot really quickly, because until really June, July this year, we know from our own Emsi Burnham Glass data, those labour markets were still relatively in the doldrums. And so the surge in demand has been very sudden and rapid. And so in some ways, candidate interest will take time to adjust. And so to some extent, doesn't explain all of it, but to some extent you expect to see them way up here. But things like property and real estate and manufacturing and logistics and supply chain too, they've been relatively strong in demand terms for quite some time, and yet they're massively tighter than they were before. And it should be said, there's not a single sector here that isn't a lot tighter than it was before the pandemic started.
And thanks, Duncan. I'm bringing you back in, David, on this. I think just to try and triangulate a couple of points you made earlier with what Duncan's just saying, if we have a somewhat finite pool of candidates, we can see the tightening has probably come from the fact that those are parts of the labour market that have really embraced apprenticeships in particular as a way of perhaps filling vacancies more so than they might have done pre-pandemic, pre-Brexit, as you described. So that might be resulting in some of the tightness. But are there other themes you think at play that might be that could well be driving some of the choices of a finite pool, where clearly there are plenty of choices now to pick from? Are you getting a sense of what might be driving some of that thinking from the candidate side?
I think one of the things that has been really interesting in the last couple of years is looking at the way in which large employers, particularly, so those who pay the apprenticeship levy, I think the levy's taken a long time to bed in, but I think in a lot of cases it now has bedded in. People understand how to use it, how to create those pipelines of talent, which maybe start with work experience, include higher apprenticeships, degree apprenticeships into the organisation. And so when I'm looking at this data, it's really interesting to see the way that Duncan's treated it. There are some sectors here that stand out to me as having some great examples. So computing, technology and digital is, as it's highlighted here. There's a tightening there, but some of the better employers who understand that what they're now not doing is offering a 12-month apprenticeship, which leads you to an apprenticeship standard, but instead they're bringing you into a digital sector, they're creating a career path for you. They're having very little problem in attracting the right level of candidates and high quality candidates. And the same with law and legal. I was looking through yesterday some of the data, and some of the top vacancies this year have had 800 or 900 applications for them when it comes to the areas of law and legal. And again, they're career orientated, they are pretty well paid, they're good choices. I mean, these are the real alternatives to university. My daughter's in the last year of school this year, so I'm having this as a very, very intense and personal conversation around the dinner table with her. What is the benefit of going to university or doing one of these degree apprenticeships? And I fall firmly on the side of degree apprenticeships. So we're seeing behind these headlines again, there's a whole load of different stories. I think there are others though, and these are employers who've probably tried to look at apprenticeships as a way of solving their acute labour problems, and I don't think they've always been well set up. So again, within property and real estate and with logistics and supply chain, we're aware of, for example, the HGV driver crisis. Now, apprenticeships are not going to solve that one for you because a lot of people don't have driving licenses. And when we looked at the property and real estate one, this is one that really piqued my interest, because when we looked at the vacancies, they were pretty close to minimum wage, but the employers were expecting young people to have a driving license and access to a car. Now, again, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out if you're paying less than £5 an hour, you're not going to be able to run a car. So I'm not sure that all employers really understand the way in which apprenticeships can be used. And therefore, you do have a little bit of, I think, just putting things out there and hope it'll solve this intense labour crisis. But I do think when you look at things like hospitality, that for me is a fascinating area where we know there are lots of big employers who are working very hard to bring people in. And you know, for many of us, actually, it was our first job. One of my first jobs was working in hospitality. It was a great foundation. But again, we're talking about minimum wage roles, quite often working weekends, and these are things that actually aren't likely to be that attractive to young people. So I think what it really is for us and the employers we work with is a wake-up call to say, how do you really think through that proposition? How is it you're really using apprenticeships to bring young people into your organization? And then how do you make it really something that's meaningful for the young person themselves? Because the days of kind of a loose labour market where anybody would take a £3.80 job because it got them off the streets, those days are well gone. And if there's anybody listening to this who thinks that still exists, yeah, let me tell you, it is not the case. But when you do think it through and when you understand what's driving young people, then actually you can bring great candidates with great training providers into the workforce, and that will solve many of the underlying structural problems we're seeing, particularly in areas I know you've been talking around, like STEM, for example, where we are seeing, I think, some really, really good and interesting programs that are using apprenticeships at their heart.
That's really fascinating, David. Thank you. And I think it does paint a fascinating picture, I suppose, in terms of a maturity around thinking about new entrants to the labour market and nurturing them as future employees as well as current employees, rather than just warm bodies filling seats, and that then consequently probably has resulted in employers being willing to pay more at this front end because they know they're getting quality candidates that are going to come through and be critical members of the workforce for years to come, as opposed to
sorry, I think you're absolutely right. Although, I mean, we pick out salary because it's an easy one to talk about and you can do nice benchmarks with it. But I think it goes far beyond salary. So some of the research we released last week was around the green agenda, not surprisingly, with COP26. And 76% of over 1,000 young people who took through the survey with us, they were saying they wanted to understand employers' view on sustainability. Not so much to kind of have it just shoved in their face, but they wanted to understand genuinely where employers sit on the topics of sustainability and green, because that's helping them make a choice. And actually, some of the largest employers in the country, we have an employer roundtable community we meet with every month, about 30, 40 of the largest employers in the country. And what they've told us this year is that they have the highest level of reneges they've ever seen. So young people accepting an offer and then 48 hours beforehand ringing up and saying, sorry, I'm not going to work with you. And again, what we're seeing is, not surprisingly, given the market dynamics, young people are able to collect 3 or 4 fantastic job offers, and then they are deciding over a period of 3 or 4 or 5 weeks which one they're actually going to go for. So having offered a job and gotten acceptance, we're having to change thinking and say that is actually not where the recruitment process ends. The recruitment process probably ends several weeks after employment, where the young person is convinced they have made the right decision for the right reasons.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. We see obviously fantastic opportunity in the labour market through the fact that there's so much demand, and it's great to see people making strong choices for various reasons, and the more we can help employers understand that, and of course a big part of your mission, we can maximize the opportunities on both sides of the supply and demand schedule. So yeah, I think this is highlighting some very interesting trends, and I'm grateful for you joining us today to kind of take a sneak peek as we dive into these, and just to sort of summarize, I think a number of the points that you had made yourself in your descriptive of the data is really about young people we often see at the forefront of change in the labour market, often for the negative, as was the worry at the front end of the pandemic, but actually we're hopefully seeing that shift around and putting young people in a great position at a time when employers are seeking strong candidates and trying to resolve new issues that they haven't had to resolve before. So I very much hope that this does put apprenticeships into a key position to help with employers solving recruitment challenges. But to your point, it's not a quick fix. It's really about thinking about embedding this long term and it becoming part of our recruitment and staff culture, rather than simply just trying to solve a Brexit problem or what have you. And of course, it is very much a buyer's market right now. So young people are making those choices and making choices across a number of different drivers, as you described. So yes, and to the last point around our candidates becoming more picky, I think with a finite volume of candidates and no lack of choices emerging, they're well within their rights to be picky, and I think that puts a new challenge onto employers. So some fascinating trends that this highlights, and the good news, hopefully if you find this interesting, is this is something that collectively we're diving into a bit more. So this is sort of lifting the lid on where we think the challenges and opportunities lie on both sides of the supply demand component there, and we're in the process of working together to bring some of these insights and test some of those hypotheses to build out, and we're working on a set of reports. I think the first one out is due out in the next week or so, with another one following on in a few weeks as we dive into these topics. And we will be welcoming David back to join us next month as we perhaps summarize some of those findings and share those with you, and provide a snapshot of what we're finding in the research we're doing together. As we said, this is an interesting time for the labour market and a massive opportunity, and a time for, I think, good knowledge and insight to drive better behaviours that can really help solve the long-term challenges of the labour market, as well as solve some of those short-term riddles and puzzles for sure. So David, thank you very much for joining us today, and thanks for joining us going forward. We have a couple of minutes, so Debbie, I'm just wondering if you might, and before I close up, you might be able to pick out whether there have been some questions we might want to quickly run through, and while we have David pose to him.
Okay, there's one here. Is the get my first job sector breakdown based on industry or occupation? So the data we had from David, is that based on industry or occupation? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's based on occupation.
Okay.
It's a really good question, because the map between apprenticeship standards and occupations is not always straightforward, but we've done the best we can to map everything back to standard occupation codes, and that's the data that Duncan kindly pulled together for us.
Okay, cool. And in terms of property and real estate, what sorts of occupations are driving this pattern? I think that might be directed to Duncan.
Well, I think David might know better because
Okay.
my first job data, but my guess is, David, that it will tend to be a various number of jobs around sort of housing managers and letting agents and that kind of thing.
It's that, and also some of the really big chains of estate agents actually do some quite large-scale programs, and there are one or two that spring to mind who do that on a national basis. So when they go to market, it tends to have a very big impact on the overall kind of apprenticeship space, and that is one of the limitations, I think, of the analysis, because a relatively few employers can have a very big impact in one of those SOC code areas, because it's not an area which is widely kind of adopting apprenticeships.
Okay. There's just one last one here. Sorry, carry on.
No, that's right. I was just scrolling through the questions as well myself, and just one thing that might help, because obviously in the early section when we're looking at the labour market statistics, there are specifically defined age groups that the ONS classifies various statistics against. But David, in terms of your typical community, so the data in the second part of this analysis that's helped us understand that kind of ratio, what is the typical age profile of your community? First question. And then the second question is, think about apprenticeships. Of course, a big driver to apprenticeships in the early days of the levy was upskilling staff as much as accessing new entrants to the labour market. So am I right in thinking that this data is likely to better reflect those accessing new entrants to the labour market than simply upskilling their staff? I'm not sure they'd need to come through your platform for that one, but correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, 100%. So broadly speaking, we have a group of candidates around 17 to 19, that's around 40% of the data. Then you have another group, 20 to 24, it's about 40% of the data, and then 10% above and below that. So that's the overall profile of the young people we're working with. To your second point, yes, you're 100% right. So the whole upskill agenda was very much based on employees who are already working for an organisation, and then they would be put onto an apprenticeship as part of that. So those opportunities would not necessarily be promoted through the platform. Although what is quite interesting is if you look at something like hospitality, the SME incentive, this is whether the incentives drive all sorts of perverse behaviours, but the SME incentives did seem to us to encourage smallish hospitality employers to advertise vacancies which required experience as part of the hiring process. So that to me felt like it was very much in the middle of this upskilling versus new entrant, because they were expecting to have people who had experience of hospitality before they would even give them an apprenticeship. That's slightly problematic for me, but that's certainly what incentives tend to do.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Sorry to cut you off there, Debbie. Did you have another one?
No, you carry on. I think you answered it. So that's great. Thank you, Andy.
No, good. A good few other questions there as well, which we will pour over afterwards and may actually come out in the research that we're putting the finishing touches to, and we'll be sharing in due course. And I should add, keep an eye on the Emsi Burning Glass website for that report as it's released in the next week or two. We're intending, and certainly come to economicmarket.co.uk to check that out. So we'll try and factor in some of these questions into that. A technical question to finish on for Duncan. Define tightening when it comes to the labour market. It's a term we used quite a lot. Might be quickly.
Well, it's a relative change of demand to supply. So a tightening normally implies that demand has either grown faster than supply or is shrinking less slowly than supply. But yeah, basically that's it. That sort of there's relatively more demand compared to supply than there was before.
Yeah, great stuff. Thank you. And thanks to everyone for those questions. They're really interesting, and hopefully we've covered off a good chunk of them, some good points in there that we'll take away. And as I say, I'm hoping we can answer down the line. So thank you. And thank you once again, David and Duncan, for joining us there. One last thing, just mark your card. Friday the 12th of November, we have another webinar. Colleagues Anthony and Will are going to be collaborating on thinking about the skills for jobs and skills white paper there, and Anthony, who has been working with us in the realm of further education, Will leads our work in the economic development, LEPs and chambers of commerce space, combining to share their thoughts and insights based on the different sides of the equation there for the skills for jobs white paper. So I would certainly recommend checking that out, and you can sign up on the usual webinars page. So thank you very much, and thanks from myself and Duncan, and from David as well, for bringing this collaborative webinar to play. We look forward to sharing the research, and be sure to sign up to next month's webinar, where we'll bring that all around for a conclusion and share our further insights with you. So thank you very much for joining us, and I'll hand back to you, Debbie, to close down.
Yeah, that's great. Just to say, you will be getting a follow-up email with your slides and with the recording. And like Andy said, go to the webinar page on our website to find all the other webinars that we're offering. So thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye.